Pre-chat over, let us introduce ourselves. I'm James Rosewell from 51 Degrees, and I'm going to be asking the questions today. I'm not a lawyer, but the gentlemen who've joined me are lawyers, and perhaps you could introduce yourselves.
I'll go first. I'm Tim Cowan. I'm a lawyer based in London, in England, and have done a lot of work in tech and telecoms over many years. I specialise in taking cases, antitrust cases in the tech and telecom sector. I was some years ago general counsel for BT, British Telecom, and I've done quite a few cases against Google, which has resulted in them being fined quite a lot of money in front of the European Commission. So we've been following very closely for the past 10 years or so all of the antitrust enforcement activity, and in particular the recent CMA investigation of digital online markets. Thanks.
Thank you. Alan?
My name is Alan Chappell. I am a certified information privacy professional. I'm outside counsel and effectively chief privacy officer to a number of advertising technology and marketing technology companies.
Thank you, Alan. And Joshua?
Hello, everyone. I'm Joshua Curran. I am a lawyer, like my colleagues here, but I spend most of my time on the product and engineering side and have done so for the past 20 years, currently heading up innovation labs at Zeta Global.
Thank you very much. So my job is to ask the questions from non-lawyers and to try and get you to answer in non-legal speak. So we'll see how I get on. I'd like to start with an introduction to who the CMA actually are. We've got quite a mixed viewership here. Perhaps, Tim, you could just give us a brief introduction of the CMA and the background.
Yeah, sure. The CMA actually stands for the Competition and Markets Authority. So to some extent, it does what it says on the tin, but it's the UK's antitrust authority, like the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission rolled into one in the States. Equivalent authorities exist worldwide pretty much now, and the European Commission has those same competition powers. So what does it do? Well, it takes enforcement actions. It doesn't take many of them. It does market studies, which it's just released, the market study, the final report on digital online markets, which investigate markets, take evidence. They've taken evidence for a very wide range of players and then make findings. And in this report, they've made findings that, for example, Google and Facebook are dominant, which would be very useful for the future, whether that's in follow-on damages cases or actions. And they also look at things like mergers, and they provide guidance on vertical restraints and full range of the antitrust activity that you would expect of any other antitrust authority.
And the jurisdiction is the UK only, or Europe as well?
The jurisdiction is based in the UK, but if you think about the way the world works, most of Europe tends to contract under English law in England. That's certainly true of most business transactions. The other thing in terms of coordination is there is an EU-US treaty on the coordination of antitrust authorities' decisions. So they seek to coordinate what they're doing with overseas authorities. And the background to this report is it follows on from a report which was commissioned by the European Commission. There's a report by the Stigler Center in Chicago, which is consistent with the findings of the CMA. And it also follows from the ACCC in Australia, where they've made very similar findings. So it's no secret that there's a huge amount of collaboration going on between the different authorities. Certainly the US officials that are at the DOJ and the Federal Trade Commission come over regularly. And until the COVID pandemic closed down people's ability to travel, there was a lot of travel between the different locations, and there were a lot of meetings taking place between the different authorities. So I think behind the scenes, you'll be seeing a lot of coordination. And we were just speculating before this call. This has been timed because of the CMA timetable, but it's very helpfully timed in relation to forthcoming congressional hearings that are going to interview all the CEOs of all of the I don't know whether you call them the GAFA or the GAFAM, but the four horsemen of the apocalypse, whatever.
And the DOJ is referring to the United States Department of Justice. Alan, have you got anything else to sort of add to how this report might be seen in the US and how it might affect things over there?
Well, right now it's a little difficult to predict, in part because the U.S. is going through an election year, and I think safe to say that this year one could see a scenario where things swing in a direction where there isn't going to be a heck of a lot of oversight, and it may continue to be rather laissez-faire. And one could also see a scenario where Congress takes a very activist role in a whole bunch of areas, including antitrust. I tend to think it's more likely that it'll be the latter, but boy, some of us were rather surprised approximately 4 years ago regarding how things shaked out. So,
okay, so it's a bit up in the air. We don't quite know, but there's stuff happening this month.
Yeah.
Fair enough. In reading the report, one of the things that comes out is just the amount of research the CMA did over the last year with input coming from publishers and advertisers. And they went into a lot of detail on how the current situation is affecting those sort of business sectors. Joshua, I'm just wondering if before we get into the detail of the report, you could provide us a quick sort of summary on the impact of publishers and why this matters, basically. Why are we here? Why are people listening to this?
Sure, I'll give a very brief summary because I don't think summarizing the entire report in 10 seconds is possible. But what the Competition and Markets Authority found is that the lack of transparency around these markets and the vertical integration of these large platforms was having an adverse effect on competition. So one example that they highlighted was this removal of interoperability or data interoperability. And hence one of their proposed remedies was specifically calling out the introduction of a common user ID. Now, why I found that particular remedy interesting is it seems to go directly against the recent announcements of Apple at their conference restricting the use of the IDFA, and of course the earlier announcements by the Chrome team saying that they would end support for the digital ID or cross-publisher ID stored in third-party cookies. Now, I know this is probably not a technical crowd, so I'll try not to go too much into the technical, but I do believe it matters for people to understand why this common user ID is an appropriate remedy, or at least a beneficial solution to supporting competition. And that's because if you look at the publisher, they have a supply chain of very distributed network partners who need this interoperability in order to bring the funds from advertisers to support those publisher operations. So the advertisers use these IDs to measure the effectiveness of their advertising, as well as to control the exposure. They don't want to overexpose their message only to a limited number of people or the same person too many times. So that frequency capping of the exposure helps better allocate their media spend to what's working and redirect their media budgets to the publishers that are attracting and driving the consumers that the advertiser wants to engage with or supporting the advertiser business. So this positive feedback loop is directly what this interference in the support of the IDs, these cross-publisher IDs, is getting at, and why I think the Competition Markets Authority was honing in on this as a remedy.
So that's a remedy around something that's quite detailed. And I think what you were saying there when you mentioned frequency capping, what that means is that I see an advert for a particular product, but I don't see it too many times or too few times, for example. And that's something that helps publishers and advertisers, right?
Correct. If you negatively impact the effectiveness of an advertiser's media spend, basically their advertising, they're now wasting more budget, right? They will pay publishers less. And in fact, that's what both Google and Facebook have, their own research has found, that when you remove these user IDs, it has over a 50% impact on these publisher revenues. So that's a very severe impact to many publishers who have already said, during this COVID crisis that they're struggling. And the subset of publishers that provide us our news, right, is probably the most troubling impact or risk to our democratic processes if they can't fund the quality content through the advertising revenue that supports our free access.
Okay, so these problems are about ultimately not, although they appear to be about advertising and technology, they're also about publishing and journalism and subjects like that.
Correct. The freedom of information, freedom of access. In essence, we have some companies that are trying to privatize the open web.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
Tim, do you want to pick up a bit more on that,
Yeah.
and particularly the competition aspects? Joshua's talked about user IDs, which is a remedy, but I think that there's also some other angles to this as well.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great place to start, because if you look at what's being proposed, you then say, well, why is it being proposed? And what the CMA is making a finding about is that if you take Google as an example, it's dominant, which means that it's a quasi-monopoly. Over what? Well, what the CMA is then looking at is to say, well, it has control over data, what people have talked about as first-party data. But if I'm the user and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go and use something, Google has, over 90% of searches, but it doesn't actually really start with the search. It starts with the browser, and Chrome is pretty much everywhere, whether it's Chrome or Chromium. Yeah. So, that's in the browser, whether it's a obvious Google Chrome browser or whether it's less obvious because it's the core engine behind, Microsoft's Edge or many other browsers. So if you look at that, you say, well, okay, you're gathering data from the PC, you're looking through a browser to a search engine, and you're gathering information from that. So Google is at browser level, it's at search level, it's then at about 100 different stages in the process, and has 40, 50, 60% of the market when you're looking at ad serving, AdSense, AdWords, all of that. So if you think in one corner, you've got Google, which is this monster with all of this, that's eaten all of this data. It's a big monster. And then you've got the other players in the market. And the other players are really looking to understand what I'm looking for. What's the user interested in? And instead of having all of that information that Google's got, they've got to really struggle to identify, rather like the position today when you're looking, to go shopping, you do market research, you've got to try and identify what it is that shoppers are looking for in the high street. So if you look at the physical world, it's a struggle. You've got to work out what it is that, that people are looking for, how they shop around. And there's a whole industry around that. Now, clearly, if those people have got all the data from the biggest stores and they control, the majority of people shopping, they're then trying to extend that position into the kind of independent part. I agree with what Joshua said, which is they're trying to privatize, they're trying to control and extend the market power that they have into kind of the free and open bit of it. And that's, a matter of enormous concern. It should be a matter of enormous concern. It's actually top of the list of the CMA's priorities of things to be dealt with. Now they've published the report. So they are taking an initiative now, because there's obviously an issue of to what extent is this dealt with by data protection? Because if I'm accessing Google, I never actually sign up to anything. I just find my data being used. By comparison, in the publisher web or the more open web, you've got a constant acceptance of, do you want to accept these cookies, manage these cookies, whatever. And it's really rather galling that Google says that it's thinking that it needs to extend its position across the world in order to more fully protect the position of privacy, which seems to me to be completely the wrong way around. Yeah. But you can see why they'd want to argue it that way.
So when you said about using Google search, you said you didn't accept terms. Google would probably say, well, you did. You just can't remember when you did, and you don't have to ask again and again and again.
Yeah, it doesn't work though. I mean, what is fundamental to the operation of any open competitive market is that the purchaser, the user, is giving their consent. Now, you can't be giving consent in a situation where you have no choice. Let me repeat that again. There is no such thing as consent in a situation where you have no choice.
Right.
That's true as a matter of contract. It's true of a basic matter of common law across multiple jurisdictions. So when the argument is put, well, you gave your consent. Well, yeah, but you're a monopoly, so that doesn't count. Where you have a choice, then it would work. And one of the things the CMA is saying is that there should be a choice. And that actually follows a case in Germany last week by the Supreme Court in Germany that said, well, you know, Facebook doesn't offer a choice to its users. So users are given a one-size-fits-all, take it or leave it set of terms and conditions. They could be given a variety of different product offerings. So you could be given a choice that says, okay, if you sign up to this limited set of things, which limits the amount of data that you're trading, you would get a limited set of services, which, you know, would be kind of more of a fairer deal. And you can see in Facebook's case, they require the transfer of the ownership, copyright, in photographs that you transfer across, and then occasionally they sell them. Maybe that wouldn't be something that you transfer across immediately. If you're an amateur, semi-professional photographer or professional photographer, you might say, no, I'm not prepared to trade the one-size-fits-all, but I will do it on an occasional basis. So you can see a new market opening up there as well, in line with the Supreme Court in Germany and the CMA's argument. I've heard the former CEO of Vodafone, Vittorio Calao, and I know that there are some, you know, big insurance companies that are looking at this because they see an opportunity for new markets to be developed in new products and data trading, which I think is quite an exciting development.
So this isn't just important for the reasons we've talked about so far. If these remedies that we'll come on and talk about in more detail in a minute actually happen, then it allows companies you wouldn't have been thinking of, like Vodafone, for example, to enter a new market that they otherwise wouldn't be getting into. So it's pretty substantial stuff. And what you were saying there is, whilst you don't effectively have a choice because you need to use search, it's something that people need, or maps or whatever it is, so you have to accept the terms and conditions. Otherwise you don't have access to what's now an essential service. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. I think if you start with, well, is it essential, you miss out on something, which is in practice. If you look at the position that Google has on search, it has had 90+% of all searches throughout all European countries. It's slightly less in America for the last 10 years or so. So to say that it's, you know, it's subject to competition, which is just a click away, which is one of the things that is said, it's clearly just nonsense. The evidence shows that is not what happens. That, you know, people typically use Google a lot, and that actually is a great lesson. It's a great reward and an accolade for Google, because it's doing a very good job. There seems to me to be a misunderstanding that, you know, it's not punishment for doing a good job to have government intervention. Actually, this is one of those things that happens to you if you've been really, really successful. So if you're really successful as a private company, then the way the law works here is that you should actually then share the benefit of that when you reach a certain size with everybody, because you're obliterating the opportunity for others.
And the report, when it goes into detail, talks about sort of 40-50% return on capital, which is absolutely amazing. I think we'd all dream of that. But Alan, do you want to say a few more words about user data and sort of continue this?
Yeah, I think there's a related issue that Google and a number of other companies are going to have to grapple with, which is how does one manifest consent when an entity is so large and is collecting data in so many different contexts that and combining that data in a number of ways, some which I think are obvious and very helpful, some of which are helpful but not obvious. How does one manifest consent if even somebody who spends most of their time thinking about these issues probably doesn't have a full understanding of all the data being collected? And that's something I know that the EU is starting to grapple with in the context of Google and perhaps even Facebook. But just from a baseline privacy perspective, that's going to be a really difficult thing for a lot of these companies to be dealing with.
Yes, and what you mean by that is that you're using multiple services from them, like Instagram and the Facebook social media platform and data from those services are combined.
Right, but also, you know, in the case of Google, I mean, you've got Google Maps, you've got Chrome, you've got YouTube, which some people may know is owned by Google, but perhaps not everybody. And then there's their whole advertising technology stack, which isn't super well branded, at least to you know the average Joe off the street. And so it's, you know, when one says, well, we've got your consent for that. That may be true that a consent was obtained, but it's I think going to become increasingly difficult to argue that the scope of the consent obtained is really in line with you know, the actual practice.
Yes, I know. I mean, the report points out some of these consent documents. As I think I saw one which was 32,000 words. You know, that just is unwieldy for even the best of us, let alone you know, anyone else. Joshua,
I wanted to follow up on what Alan just said, and that we seem to be placing an undue burden on consumers to have to understand all of the technology within a vertically integrated company, much less a distributed internet system. So if we look at any other industry, right, we don't mandate that the consumer understand the entire supply chain of every organization they interact with or do business with. When you buy a car, you probably don't know how many different subcontractors and providers of the parts that went into your car, where it was put together. And frankly, that's not really your top concern in choosing an automobile, right? You're looking at the end product that's delivered to you and ensuring that it's safe. And I think that that's where the industry probably took a wrong turn, you know, over 15 years ago, in trying to create this artificial distinction between a first party and a third party, given that most publishers do not write software, or at least not the extent of software required to operate their business. They require a supply chain of partners. And smaller publishers often need to work with other publishers through ad technology or publisher technology to provide better content recommendations so they can become larger publishers. If we were to restrict that operation solely to vertically integrated companies, right, we would be actually going back to the original form of the internet, of a CompuServe AOL type model. But I don't think that that would be the desired outcome by most consumers.
So you've described a sort of situation there going back 15 years. Do you feel the report, you know, recognizes these problems and brings them out?
I do. They did focus on the first parties, the publishers who have a direct relationship with the people who visit and interact with their content. They noticed that under today's regime, they really don't have that much control over the data, and they're unfortunately being I'm looking for a softer word than bullied, but they're being forced into a contract where they are having to agree to terms that are not really a fair negotiation. I mean, the most recent example, just to you know, illustrate the point, is in GDPR compliance. You need to have a legal basis to collect and process data at all, right? It's unlike the States, which is an opt-out regime. In Europe, it's an opt-in regime. And the IAB, Internet Advertising Bureau, created a framework called the Transparency and Consent Framework, or TCF for short. And Google has long held out from that. They wanted their own different version of a similar consent framework. However, through a lot of negotiation, Google and the IAB agreed that they would compromise and Google would join the rest of the internet's framework for collecting and communicating the signals of what data is collected, how is it being used. Unfortunately, Google is actually not allowing the publishers to fully use that framework. They're dictating that any publisher who uses their technology, and they have a overwhelming share of publisher ad server market share, that they interpret GDPR to a very limited, narrow scope. So instead of all of the various legal bases that are available, they are only allowed to use this narrow legal basis of consent. Now, the problem, as I mentioned earlier, is if a consumer doesn't understand the supply chain of the publisher they're visiting, and now Google requires the consumer to have to understand that supply chain, it ends up with a Swiss cheese effect for many of these publishers that don't own and operate their own software. Whereas a vertically oriented company or vertically integrated company does not have that same choice to a consumer, right? To Tim's point, it's a take it or leave it.
So, and it's vertical integration where, as Alan was saying, data can be shared across multiple parts of that integration. So what you do on maps is available to search, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Now, just before we leave the subject of data, there's lots of different types of data. There's a name, a telephone number, an email address, and there's something called pseudonymous identifiers. At least those that are mentioned in the report and lots more. So not all data is the same. How does the report respond to that? I don't know, maybe Joshua and Alan, you'd like to take that question? Right. Alan, do you want to?
I'll let Joshua handle it.
Okay.
So you're very correct, James. There are different types of personal data, the data that we as individuals generate as we navigate around the web. Some of those are tied to our applications or devices, right? These cookies or a mobile identifier of some sort, like the IDFA we referenced earlier from Apple. Other IDs are the ones you listed, which are less easy for a consumer to be able to reset, right? Their home address, their first name, their email, their telephone number. While some of those IDs can be reset, it's a huge pain, right? So that separate set, which is often called a directly identifiable identifier, has a much higher bar under privacy regulations than the pseudonymous IDs, these digital IDs that have undergone the proper operational and technical procedures to keep them distinct from your directly identifiable offline identity. So this is I think, useful distinction between the IDs that we're talking about, because the advertisers tend not to advertise to people by their first name, right? They advertise to them based on the content they're engaging with or the prior content they've engaged with, right? All they need is a pseudonymous identifier. Oftentimes, they don't even care about the content you have previously seen. They care about their ad that you previously saw, going back to our original frequency cap control example. They just want to ensure that their spend is being allocated appropriately across lots of people, not focused only on the same individual over and over again. So that's a big distinction that is called out in GDPR. It's also called out in the California law here, CCPA, potentially to be updated with a new version of CCPA 2.0 or CRPA.
That's for another webinar.
All right, but that calls these same IDs de-identified IDs when they have undergone these technical operational procedures to keep them distinct, because they are less privacy intrusive and they have lesser harms associated with them.
So we have a situation where, as Tim was saying, the dominance of an essential service effectively requires people to accept those terms. You don't really have a choice. In doing so, you tend to provide personal information, name, email, telephone number, etc. And because of the scale of the organizations that have achieved that level of success, people tend to do it. But then you also have something that's personal data, which you called a pseudonymous ID, which is easy to reset, presumably clearing cookies on your browser or some other method. And that's also treated as sort of personal data, and it allows to achieve these good things that allow journalists and publishers to be able to make additional revenue, and arguably, depending on your point of view, helps people receive more relevant advertising based on their interests and past browsing history. And smaller publishers who don't have that scale aren't able to collect that as much personal information, and potentially there's proposals to remove some of these pseudonymous IDs, and the report is kind of recognizing the competition issues that this generates. Is that a fair summary so far?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. And James, just while you're on the point, I think one important point to bring out is the problem of the black box and marking your own homework, because one of the issues that happens here is that there are some publishers out there that will performance advertising and that type of thing, where they only get paid if you actually deliver a sale to the end user. And obviously, if you've got that type of a system, which is not the Google system or the Facebook system, then you've got a pretty clear idea that if you're the advertiser, your advert is getting through, because, you know, if it's not seen, it's not going to get clicked on, it's not going to generate a sale. The mechanism by which the effectiveness of advertising is assessed within Google and Facebook is a process which is well known as marking your own homework. Now, the problem with marking your own homework is it's not subject to any external verification. You don't actually know who it is that's seen the advert, or whether or not it's been clicked on by a human being. And there have been, a layer of problems around that. So one of the things the CMA calls out is that, how do we know whether or not these systems are actually very effective? If you're the advertiser, you don't really know. So there's a lack of transparency in measuring ad impressions on inventory, on your own inventory. And that is a particularly severe problem in what's known as the open display market, where publishers and advertisers rely on intermediaries to manage real-time bidding. So that's called out as a particular issue, and from which, they're suggesting, and this is probably something that should have been in the headlines, the CMA is saying, well, this can only really be addressed if you've got a separation of the different layers of vertical integration. So there needs to be third-party access and separation remedies put in place, rather in the same sort of vein as happened between AT&T and the regional Bell companies some years ago. So that's quite a radical point.
So,
it's very, very important.
So if we're moving on to remedies, sorry, Alan, tell us more about how that would work, because
Well, no, I'm just saying that this sort of goes to a framing issue that frankly Google and Facebook have done an excellent job of. If you remember Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in front of Congress a couple of years ago, the whole argument was, yes, where we failed is that we didn't protect you, the user, from these horrible third parties. So it's a little bit of a misdirection, because it was, well, don't worry about what we're doing. No, we're great at keeping it safe. It's where we failed is that we let these other companies, who, boy, nobody can trust, and we should not have let those other companies have access to data. And it's that very framing that allows larger market participants to frame what might be regarded as anti-competitive behavior as being privacy protective.
So where you've got privacy regulators in the UK, we've got the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. There are obviously others in different jurisdictions. Have they sort of accepted that narrative in the way you've just explained it there, Alan? And this Competition and Market Authority report is either butting up against that, so it's saying it's gone too far, the regulation around privacy has allowed some of these perhaps self-serving scenarios to occur, or are these compatible with each other? Any insight on that?
I think there's a natural tension between those two concepts, and again, I think some of the larger companies have been very effective at framing it in this way. With respect to how a regulator views the marketplace, I think nobody wants to be painted with the brush of, you aren't doing the right thing by privacy. And I think that one of the things that large internet companies have been able to leverage is that this time is different. This isn't exactly the same thing as what happened in the telecommunications industry a couple of decades ago. There's enough differences that there's an open question whether current competition law is really adequately suited to address it. And so as between those two things, you've got a competition law which sort of recognizes that there might be an issue here, but isn't exactly clear on how that issue can be addressed, versus privacy, which they can, one can look at it and say, well, if we don't allow data to go to larger number of entities, then that's privacy protective, and people can kind of get their head around that logically. And frankly, I think that story has been sold not just to regulators, but even privacy advocates. And it's hard to understand what their long-term strategy is, but it might be that, well, if you decrease the number of entities that have the data, then we can focus our attention down the line on the entities who do. Because right now it's, well, we don't know who has access to data because there's a large number of market participants.
So the most efficient solution is a monopoly.
I think that's actually the tension, that a monopoly may be more efficient, but in most democracies and open societies, we prefer the open marketplace that allows this innovation, new entrants and startups to come in and offer new services, new twists and approaches to addressing consumer and business challenges. And we prefer that to the controlled economy or a monopoly-based rule, which I think is the natural tension that Alan was bringing up.
Can I just, in terms of this natural tension, I feel a bit like, was it a little boy that said the emperor has no clothes? Because I don't think there should be any tension between privacy and competition, because both of them rest on the idea of consumer choice. You start from the point of view that the consumer should choose. And as I said before, you don't have an effective choice when you're dealing with a monopoly. So what the privacy advocate should be advocating is the consumer should have an effective choice, which is freely given in circumstances of open competition, because otherwise it doesn't really exist. It's a mirage, it's misdirection. It's not really privacy protection. It's the imposition of terms that have been unfairly imposed in circumstances of market power. So you're not exercising an effective choice, and you're not electing in any sensible, objective way a set of terms that you've chosen by comparison with anything else. So, you know, what is it that, my battery's running out on my computer. Hang on a moment.
Just while Tim sorts out his battery, I'll
dramatic pause.
Yes, I'll move on to come back to that issue of separation. Sorry, Tim, do you want to?
Yeah, no, sorry. It's just my plug fell off.
Okay.
It's one of those wonderful technical plugs that's magnetic and it falls off occasionally. So yeah, just going to finish off the point. So if there were an effective choice, you could address both the privacy obligations and the competition obligations. The problem you've got is the structure of the market. And what the CMA is saying here is, look, the market is so entrenched and so riddled with monopolistic practices that they reinforce each other. So, you know, we need to address this in a holistic way, and we need to address it with international coordination. So what I think is fascinating about this is it's a very, very detailed, very carefully argued and analysed report, which is based on a huge amount of evidence. So it's kind of properly based. It's, I think, will provide ammunition for both third parties and other governments to then act. And it provides an analytical basis on which to act in a coordinated way. So it analyses this problem of, you know, access to data very clearly. And the points I'm making about, you know, data and privacy being, you know, starting in the same place, they should really be addressed. That's in the report. I didn't make that up. It wasn't my brilliant insight. I'm simply repeating what's written there. So the conclusion is you then need to create choice. How do you create choice? Well, you impose on the organizations an obligation to provide choice. And that requires regulation, it requires intervention, it requires, you know, people monitoring and policing the activity on a forward-looking basis so that effective choice is really put in place.
So moving on then with that theme of remedy, the report talks about separation. That could be perhaps a sell-off or operational separation. But it seems to me that the UK alone is probably not going to be effective there. You talked just now, Tim, about working with other jurisdictions. I'm wondering if, Alan, you could sort of come in on the how could that work in practice? How would the US get involved in that remedy?
Well, I think that, you know, as Tim had said, that I think the U.S. oftentimes likes to go it alone, but I think there is going to be at least some pressure when one looks across the pond to say, well, look what they're doing, look what they're saying. Maybe that creates some pressure, but I am skeptical that anything happens in the next 6 months here in the U.S. on almost any front. I mean, heck, we're barely keeping up with the pandemic, it's difficult to see that this is going to be, as important an issue as this is. It's hard to see that it's even in the top 10 right now of things going on in the U.S. And that's a reality that we have to deal with, and probably a reality that some of the larger participants are exploiting.
Okay, so although the report recognizes these issues and has exposed some of those remedies in practice, it's going to be 2021 before it even gets onto the agenda.
That would be my sense. There's one X factor here that might be worth pointing out, and that's if the EU Court of Justice were to strike down both Safe Harbor, the Privacy Shield program, and standard contractual clauses. I could see a scenario where that triggers a number of things within the U.S. because I think at that point the U.S. may be forced to actually come up with a program that is satisfactory to the EU Commission, and that may create a bit of a groundswell in a number of areas, and internet regulation certainly being one.
Could you just give us 30 seconds on that bit about Privacy Shield and the EU, because that's not directly related to the report, but it sounds like it could be a material amplifier for the recommendations.
Well, July 16th, I think we're expecting a ruling from the EU Court of Justice, and I won't go into all the details of the case, but effectively what they're ruling on is whether the mechanisms by which hundreds, if not thousands, of companies transfer personal data from the EU into the US, whether those legal mechanisms are valid as a matter of EU law. Now, if they say that they are not valid, then basically what that means is that all those hundreds or thousands of companies who transfer data from the EU into the US are now effectively doing so either illegally or they will have to stop. And that could create a really significant groundswell within the marketplace and put pressure on at least the Congress within the US to act in a number of areas. And once that happens, these things have a way often of generating momentum.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're going to move on to Q&A very shortly, and some takeaways from this. One of them is to keep an eye on the 16th of July and what happens in relation to Privacy Shield and the topics Alan has just mentioned. Maybe we'll do another webinar after that. Just before we move on to Q&A, I've just got another few questions on the next steps for people. So the one thing I want to just bring up is the DMU that is being recommended is created from the report, which is a new government organization. I was just wondering, Tim, if you could say a little bit about that and the deadline of the 31st of July, because I think there's a very short period of consultation on this subject.
Yeah, the proposal in the report isn't particularly new. It's based on a report that was called the Furman Report, which came after something that I and some colleagues wrote some years ago called Technopoly. We came to a slightly different conclusion, and I'm flagging this because I saw that there's a question from...
Yeah, but you can answer it now, go on.
No, we can answer it in Q&A, but I'm just flagging the point that what the government came up with was a kind of interinstitutional kludge, if I can call it that. This is a new organisation which is going to straddle existing organisations, which is a digital markets unit. Now, I'm very sceptical. It may work. I think actually what I'm seeing is the development of a new government agency in the UK, which is going to deal with all things digital. And people are being very British and far too polite about saying who should be in charge of it, because the body concerned straddles the jurisdiction of the CMA, the Competition and Markets Unit. But obviously there are things that the Competition and Markets Unit does that are broader than digital. If you say digital runs everything, that's fine, but we still have an energy regulator and an Office of Communications. So we have we have that straddling of existing government departments. And this is an activity that needs to cover many of them. So there's a digital markets unit, there's a consultation on that, which is for which responses are due at the end of July. It's a very short response. The extent to which that's going to be influenced, I don't know. But I mean, I think there's quite a lot of people who are saying, look, it needs to stand on its own 2 feet. You know, if you look at Ofcom, which is the equivalent of the Federal Communications Commission, does it really have any purchase or substance of activity beyond this? Probably not. So you can see a new organisation which is a lot more effective than perhaps the previous Ofcom, staffed in a different way with new people, etc., etc. So there is an element of jobs for the civil servants involved in this, which probably means it'll happen. So you know, if you're very cynical about, well, institutionally that doesn't look feasible, you've got to remember that the people who would like it to happen are partly within government and in institutions, and if it gives opportunities for civil servants to get new jobs, then I think it's probably more likely to happen than not.
Well, that's very cynical, but there we go. It's been suggested this body is called Off Data in the chat channel, so maybe they can consider that name. We can put that suggestion forward for the 31st of July. So I seem to be, although there's a 31st of July consultation period in practical terms for businesses in publishing and advertising and technology, there's not really much they can do in that time period.
Oh, it's a consultation, and depends on what people have got to say. It will be listened to.
Yeah, okay. So worth considering if you want to get into the detail and you care about the mandate for DMU. So coming on then to the Q&A, we had a question in relation to the precursor to this and res publica, which stays with you, Tim. So you wrote a report back in 2018 called Technopoly and What to Do About It, which was sort of one of the precursors to this piece of work. And the question is really, how closely do the findings from the CMA match what you envisaged in the report?
I think it goes in the same direction. The Technopoly report, which was published by Res Publica, it's available online, that picked up on a set of findings by Jason Furman in the United States, which he published as the chief economic advisor to the Obama administration, at the very tail end of the Obama administration, just before President Trump became the president. So it was kind of, it wasn't really well seen. It was picked up by The Economist and various other places, which looked at the structure of the economy generally and the problem with digital markets. So the Technopoly report picked that up and said, well, what are we going to do about it? Because I've been litigating cases for many, many years, and you can take a case and win it, and not much then changes. Now, the observations that I made then, I think, still could be made now, which is the real issue is the time it takes for a public administration to take a case. You know, one of the old jokes is, what does Intel, Microsoft, and Google have in common? To which the answer is the antitrust cases each took 10 years. Other than that, nothing. You know, 10 years is far too long for a case that's in the high-tech, fast-moving market. So that's ridiculous. Why does it take so long? Well, this is down in the weeds, and it comes down to disclosure and evidence and looking for evidence and case characterization. But these are things that civil servants aren't trained in. You know, my background is I'm a barrister, I'm a litigator, so I deal with those issues day to day. It's not something that is the standard skill set of somebody who's recruited into any civil service anywhere in the world. So I think it starts with that issue, which is, you know, wrong person for the job. So, you know, one of the things which is also peculiar about these agencies is that they don't employ externals. They develop the cases themselves for reasons that are totally beyond me. It's much, much easier, as pretty much every organization in the world understands, to get an external lawyer to do the work. Why? Because if it goes wrong, you can blame them. Being very cynical about it. But, you know, authorities don't seem to operate that way. They seem to be far too precious about their political positions. So, you know, they don't take multiple actions. They take the occasional case and expect to be listened to, like a sort of, in a giving out tablets of stone type of way. And that's just not what, it doesn't work. You know, the companies in the tech sector just ignore them. So you can find, Google's been fined over 9 billion in euros, pounds or whatever, however you did the exchange rate. It's small change. One of my associates worked out that if you fined Google the maximum 10% of its turnover, it would make no difference to profit, because so much of its turnover is profit. So, you just pay it's like somebody who owns a Porsche and that can afford to pay off every time somebody stops you for parking fines or speeding tickets. You just zoom around everywhere at 160 miles an hour because you can afford it. That's not really very good for a rule of law point of view, or from a effective enforcement perspective, because it means that nobody, people see that non-compliance pays. You continue to make a fortune out of non-compliance, so that has to stop. And the CMA is a step in the direction of that, but it could go a lot further. I think the institutional reform which is being put forward in the DMU may go there, but they would have to pick up this basic hot potato, which is the need to have people in the organization that aren't simply making policy, but they're actually really about enforcement. They have enforcement, in their, underneath their fingernails and in their DNA. So
that's the observation to make then to in the next few weeks is exactly as you've just described. But I was hearing there a little bit of cynicism about the length of time these things take. Those of us on the sharp end of technology at the moment will know a lot about what Google are proposing in Privacy Sandbox. Apple, in their announcement the other week, are also making quite radical changes to their ecosystem as well. We haven't got years, let alone months. So just turning to Joshua, the third-party sort of cookie situation, Privacy Sandbox, do you think this has a bearing in the short term on that, and what can our viewers start thinking about doing in order to prepare for that?
So many people may not be familiar with what Google is proposing in the Privacy Sandbox. Everyone may have heard that they want to eliminate support for these cross-publisher IDs, often stored in these cookie files. They recognize, given their own research, this negative impact to publisher revenues, right? At least 50, in some cases over 60%. And so they did want to come up with a solution. Unfortunately, the solution they proposed, called Privacy Sandbox, which is an umbrella term for a number of different APIs, would limit the information that is sent back out to the supply chain of the publishers. So it limits the accuracy of the data, the amount of data, and even the timeliness of that data. Now, all three of those would negatively impact the ability of the supply chain partners of these publishers to have algorithms that improve the matching of content to people, or for advertisers to measure how well their ads are being matched to people, or even of those exposed, how many subsequently interact with the marketer's own properties or products. So given that negative impact from Privacy Sandbox to the advertisers, who will then naturally either shift their budgets to the areas not being impacted, like the walled gardens themselves, or reduce how much they pay the publishers for the linear impact on their effectiveness, right? We have a clear problem that was highlighted within the CMA report, which is why they were proposing one of these remedies would be the reversal of that, and having actually a better user ID that operates across the various publishers, allows these supply chain vendors to better support the publishers, allows marketers to get more effective measurement of their ads, while still balancing, and they do recognize it's a balance with the privacy issues that Alan brought up earlier. So I'm actually optimistic that given the report and its detail and its recommendations, that other regimes may look to this to either issue injunctions or ideally actually support the improved version of advertising that is required to have a competitive and distributed open web. Because the alternative is that all the publisher content must be monetized within these large vertically integrated companies, because of the disparity in the control and effectiveness that they can offer advertisers.
So I think to if I've heard that correctly, the proposal from Google actually introduces more anti-competition issues effectively, which the report does recognize. And I think you're saying the report also recognizes the need to do something about that and to balance those anti-competition issues with the privacy issues. But I think what we're all saying in different ways is if it takes 2 years to do anything about that, then the ship would have sailed and the anti-competition problem will have got worse. And coming back to some of your observations at the beginning of this session, some of those publishers may be no more, some of those technology companies may be no more, and that damages democracy and all the other services that are dependent on that.
Cool.
So
there's your question, James. Should I just answer your question? Because I think if a suitable case can be brought, I mean, if you're looking at third-party cookies, where there's a very clear intent to, Google's published what it wants to do, and there's quite a long time frame. It's going to happen. You can see what the consequences are. Nobody's really arguing the consequences aren't going to be, problematic. You've now got a very detailed report. Now, the question is, which authority would you put a case in front of which says, look, you should freeze the status quo until the legislation, all these other actions are going to be put in place in this coordinated way among all of you? There's quite a lot of opportunity for any one of the authorities to take injunctive action. The European Commission has taken it, it's got interim powers of enforcement, and they've been using that much more recently. They've discovered they've had this power for years but haven't used it very much. And in an attempt to address the criticism that I've had about why does it take you so long, it wouldn't matter if it took a long time if they froze the problem before it happened and then took a long time to investigate it afterwards. That would act against the interests of those that are actually exploiting the position. So actually much depends on this interim enforcement position. The CMA could take interim action. European Commission to take interim action. They could do it in a coordinated way. And Chris Marsden has just put on the chat, the Bundeskartellamt in Germany appears to be the hottest enforcement ticket in town. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to the great embarrassment of shame of all of these authorities, the Bundeskartellamt is out there in front and is taking cases much more quickly, frankly, than any of the others. Strangely enough, also the FAS in Russia imposed remedies some time ago, long before the CMA got round to realizing that there was a problem. So, there are authorities out there that are taking action and are really making a difference. The Russian position perhaps is a little unusual, but it has clearly made a difference.
Okay, thank you. So there are certainly vehicles to give hope that things can happen within the existing powers, and lots of talk about different bodies as well as the UK CMA.
You won't get any of the authorities to do any of the work unless somebody asks them to take the case. Nobody's actually asked them yet. So I think that's a
call to action, everyone.
That's a call to action, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So we've got to consider that for our next steps. So just in the final minute, just turning to Alan, Joshua, and Tim in order. Do you see Google and Facebook, who are the prime subjects of this report, taking any action, sort of voluntarily, to effectively stop some of the things that they're doing and engaging perhaps more effectively on these issues?
Well, I think that they will do something. I think it may come off to those who are cynical as window dressing at best, but I think they will do the minimum that they have to do in order to be able to claim that they've addressed the issue, if they choose to address it at all. That's sort of my feeling.
Okay. Any other views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rational decision would be not to do many of these things because it actually makes more money. If you look at it from an advertising point of view, if you're completely concerned about the bottom line, if you look at, for example, Google's self-promotion and discrimination in favor of its own price comparison websites, it would make more money if it allowed others to promote products which then were successfully advertised. By self-promotion, you actually degrade the quality of the advertising experience, which is bad for your ad revenue. So it's not really that clever to do as they've done. Perhaps the only reason why that's been the case is because specialized search engines potentially attack your core monopoly in search. Maybe that's a strategic reason for exclusion. But actually, in many, many cases, compliance with the law makes you more money. So you could be quite brutal about that and say, yeah, that's worth doing.
So lots of incentive to read the report and consider voluntarily implementing some of its recommendations for good commercial reasons. So look, we're out of time. Just before I thank our panelists, I think we've covered the fact that this is not just affecting ad tech and those people who understand what a third-party cookie is in technical detail. We've discussed ramifications across publishing, journalism, advertising, and even opportunities for businesses to enter sectors that previously didn't exist if all the recommendations from the report happen. We've discussed the time frame that's involved, and that there's some hope that existing powers are enough, not just in the UK but in other jurisdictions, in order to make meaningful change in months, not years. So there's a lot to be hopeful about. But I think the key thing is to lean in and understand a little bit more about what's going on. Do provide us feedback on this web seminar. If there's other things that you would like to see discussed or find out more about, that would be very helpful in us sort of shaping our agenda. So all that remains is for me to thank Tim, Alan and Joshua for their time and insight, you for listening and for bearing with some of our technical issues. I know we had to switch platform at the last moment, and we had a few challenges there. So thank you for the team for the production of this, and you for watching, and do provide your feedback and lean in. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, James.
Cheers,
Thank you, James.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.